False dilemma is also known as false dichotomy. I've also heard it called the either-or fallacy. You're given two options and told that you should certainly reject one of them, so you're forced to accept the remaining option. This is a fallacy when the options you're given don't include all the real options. Here's an example. He's either voting Democrat or Republican. He's not voting Republican, therefore he must be voting Democrat. Now, looking at this in purely logical terms, there's nothing wrong with this argument. In fact, this is an instance of one of the valid argument forms we saw in the tutorial course called Common Valid and Invalid Argument Forms. This is called Disjunctive Syllogism, or disjunctive argument. The problem here isn't with the logic. The problem is with the assumption that the only two options are voting Democrat or Republican. Maybe his dad is going to vote for the Green candidate, or the Libertarian candidate, or maybe he'll decide not to vote at all. There are lots of other possibilities. So the problem is with the truth of that first premise. It sets up a false dilemma, or a false dichotomy. Either A is true or B is true. There's no third option. But there are other options. Note that you can't fix this argument by including the other options, because then the logic wouldn't work. If you add the other options, then you can't infer any single one of them. If the options are that he'll definitely vote Democrat or Republican or Green or Libertarian, and you know that he's not voting Republican, then all you can infer is that he's going to vote Democrat or Green or Libertarian. The logic won't let you pick out any single one of them. Here's the summary version of this fallacy. This is a content fallacy and not a logical fallacy, so detecting it requires that you evaluate the truth or falsity of the major premise, the one that sets up the dilemma. This fallacy can be hard to detect because it relies so much on your background knowledge to judge whether the dilemma is plausible or not, and it's subject to the same relativity that any judgment of plausibility is subject to. Different audiences may judge the premise to be plausible or implausible, depending on their background knowledge and their preconceptions about the issue. For example, here's a pretty common argument about God and evolution that you may have encountered. Either you believe in God or you believe in evolution. They can't both be true. Well, I believe in God, so I have to reject evolution. Before we talk about the plausibility of that first premise, let me make a note about the logical form being used. If you recall the tutorial on common valid and invalid argument forms, you might remember these argument forms that use or, the disjunction. You get the form on the left when you assert that A or B must be true and then deny one of the disjuncts, which allows you to infer that the remaining disjunct must be true. This is a valid argument form. Now, our example above doesn't have this form. In premise 2, we're affirming one of the disjuncts and using this to infer that the remaining disjunct must be false. But we know that this argument form isn't valid if the or is an inclusive or. That's the case we're describing in the middle. It's only valid if the or is an exclusive or. That's the case on the right. Now, to say that the or is inclusive is to say that it's possible that A and B could both be true, that it includes this possibility. With an exclusive or, you're excluding this possibility. You're saying that either A is true or B is true, but they're mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. So, should we treat this argument about God and evolution as making an exclusive or claim or an inclusive or claim? It's important because if it's an exclusive or claim, then the argument as given is valid. But if it's an inclusive or, then the argument is invalid. In this case, it's not too hard to see that the arguer is intending this as an exclusive or. The key phrase is, you can't have it both ways. So we're looking at an argument that is intended to function like the valid form on the right. So on this reading, the argument is valid and it satisfies the logic condition. The only question that remains is whether it satisfies the truth condition, whether that exclusive or disjunctive premise is plausible or not. This is our question. Is it true that belief in God is incompatible with belief in evolution? If you think it's false, then this argument is guilty of posing a false dilemma. If you think it's true, then it's not posing a false dilemma, it's posing a genuine dilemma. One thing we can say for sure about this argument is that, as phrased, the meaning of that first premise is ambiguous. It's too ambiguous to allow us to properly evaluate the claim. How you answer this will depend on what specifically you think belief in God entails, and what belief in evolution entails. For example, if you interpret belief in God and belief in evolution like this, the way a biblical literalist might, then you do have a real incompatibility. A literal reading of Genesis really is incompatible with the orthodox Darwinian conception of the origins and evolution of life on Earth. So for an audience who holds these beliefs, this argument does not commit the fallacy of false dilemma. Given this reading of the premises, this is a real dilemma. But it would be different if the conception of God at issue was something like this. On this reading, the God hypothesis merely entails the view that there is an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being who is responsible for the existence of the universe and the laws of nature. It doesn't say anything about the Bible or creation in 6 days. Now, if someone offered this argument using this conception of God and evolution, they would be guilty of posing a false dilemma. Why? Because there's no reason to think that these are mutually exclusive claims. A creator God like this might exist, or the conventional evolutionary story about the origins of life on Earth might be true, or both might be true. This is, in fact, the view held by many religious people and religious scientists. This view is consistent with the official position of the Catholic Church, for example. So whether or not this argument commits the false dilemma fallacy depends on how you interpret each of the horns of the proposed dilemma. Vague or ambiguous language allows for multiple interpretations. In my view, this is one of the ways that false dilemmas acquire the persuasive power that they have. When the claims at issue are clear and precisely articulated, it's easier to see on their face whether they're logically compatible or not, or whether there are other alternatives that aren't being considered. If they're vague or ambiguous, different interpretations can get muddled in your head, which makes it easier for a false dilemma to come across as a genuine dilemma. Here are some examples that illustrate a couple of general points about false dilemmas. First, as we've seen, not all dilemmas or dichotomies are false. Every positive natural number is either even or odd. Well, this is true. This is just the number sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on forever. Every number in this set is either even or odd. But this claim is different. Every real number is either even or odd. This claim is false. Even and odd only apply to integers. The real numbers include all the integers, so some real numbers are even or odd. But the reals also include decimal numbers like 2.5 or 1.99, and these are neither even nor odd. So this poses a false dilemma. Second and finally, one of the most common forms of the fallacy occurs when a choice is presented that really represents the two ends of a continuum of possibilities. For example, when someone says, either you support minimal government and free markets or you're a socialist. They're setting up the dilemma as a choice between libertarianism, which is associated with minimal government, free markets, and minimal state interference in the lives of citizens, and socialism, which is associated with collective ownership, state regulation of the economy, and forced redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor. This setup ignores the range of intermediate possibilities between these two poles, such as the various forms of classical welfare liberalism that try to strike a balance between libertarianism and socialism. When false dilemmas show up in this form, it's sometimes called the fallacy of black and white thinking, for obvious reasons. It sets up a choice in terms of stark contrasts and ignores the various shades of gray that might exist in between. This is, I think, the most common and worrisome form of the false dilemma fallacy. Unfortunately, because the fallacy isn't a purely logical one, diagnosing it requires that you actually know something about the subject matter, and that's not something that can be taught in a logic class.